All right,
Got
hold
it.
on. 2 more seconds.
Done. All right. So let me take a minute to welcome all of you here to our monthly public event, Fireside. And we are delighted and honored to have Sovaida Ma'ani. It really, I mean, it was so happy to read everything that she has done and all her accomplishments. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Sovaida, but before we do that, I'd like to ask Don Karpowski to say the opening prayer for us.
Sure. O thou kind bestower, O nourisher of our souls and hearts, we have no aim except to walk thy path. We have no wish except to bring thee joy. Our hearts are united, our souls are united, and our hearts are welded each to each. In offering thee our thanks and praise, in following thy ways, and in soaring in thy skies, we are all one. We are helpless, stand thou by us and give us strength. Thou art the protector, the provider, the kind.
In terms of logistics, at the end of Mrs. Mani's talk, you might have some questions or comments. Please do add them to chat, and Nabil Yazdani will read each of those questions off to Sovaida for her answer. If you are on YouTube, I'm going to give you my phone number. Write it down. Send me your question via text, and we will present your question to Sovaida. My phone number is 281-788-0380. 281-788-0380. Sovaida's talk is about finding meaning and opportunity in our global suffering. We really have had a very difficult time the last 18 months or so with COVID and the lockdowns and the vaccinations and all that. Sovaida's contention is that some good has come out of this, all this that has happened to us. And so she's going to share her views on that. Sovaida Ma'ani Ewing is a prolific author. She's a speaker, international lawyer, life mastery coach, and founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance, which is cpgg.org, which is a virtual think tank and online forum that proposes principled solutions to pressing global challenges. Her latest book, available on Amazon, is The Alchemy of Peace: 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace. And I went to Amazon last night and placed an order for it. I wish I had already read it and I could tell you what a great book it was. I can't just yet, but I will. We are delighted. We are excited to have Sovaida Ma'ani here to talk to us about finding meaning and opportunity in our global suffering. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Sovaida. It's all yours.
Thank you, Ajit. Thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank you mostly for inviting me here today, the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Austin, Texas. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think most of you are from Texas. It's a community I don't get to meet very often, so this is such a wonderful opportunity, and I look forward to having a dialogue with you after I'm done sharing some reflections in this presentation. Many of you have your screens off anyway, so I'm not going to feel too badly about sharing my screen. Sometimes I like to see people's faces, and so I'm not sure about whether to do a PowerPoint, but I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen before I start. And then that way we can all be on the same page together. Whoops, all right. Okay, so welcome again. The topic for this evening is finding meaning and opportunity in our global suffering. We're still in the throes of the suffering and in the throes of trying to discover whether there is any meaning, and if so, what it is, and whether there are any opportunities, and if so, what they are. As Ajit pointed out, our world has been and continues to be buffeted by crises from every side. These crises have unleashed suffering on a scale hitherto not experienced by the entirety of the human race simultaneously in a very long time, probably worse than anything we've ever seen. The suffering is physical, it is mental and psychological, and also spiritual. My purpose tonight is to instill that rarest of commodities in all of you and in us, which is hope. It is a commodity that is in very short supply these days. Now, there is a truth that nothing in life has meaning until we assign meaning to it. This is actually a very deep principle. You know, things just are, but whether they're good or bad depends on what we've decided they are, that they're good and that they're bad. And we tend to assign meaning based on the basis of lenses. You can think of lenses of glasses, or filters is another word to describe the same thing, through which we view reality. These lenses or filters determine how we interpret what is happening in our reality. So when each of us looks at the pandemic, at the economic recession, at the vaccine nationalism, at the social injustices like endemic racism, we interpret what's happening differently. We interpret why it's happened, what it means, what it ought to be, what it should have been, and what we think is going to happen in the future based on our individual lenses. These lenses are shaped by our individual and community past experiences, our histories, our values, our media, our culture, and our families. And each of us has different influences that have played on us. And so our filters, and therefore the way we interpret what is happening in our world, are different. Now, these filters are similar, if you like, and I'm mixing my metaphors here, but if you think about them, these filters trigger certain emotions that drive us. And these emotions function like the operating system of a computer. Like tonight, we have the Zoom going, and we have a PowerPoint presentation, and we've got sound and video and all of this. And we know how to use the computer, but none of us is aware of all the code that somebody has written to make these pieces of software work, not to mention that we don't know how the hardware itself, all the bits and pieces that make this computer actually function. And yet these things drive the operating system, and they drive the software, and therefore drive our experience. Now, these filters are like the operating system. They then trigger certain emotional reactions in us. So how we choose to interpret what's going on triggers an emotional reaction, which in turn triggers what we do, our behaviors. And behaviors that are done over and over again become habits. And when enough people engage in those habits, it becomes the culture of a society, which then determines our societal reality. So you see, the root cause of everything starts with the mind, with how we interpret what's going on. Now, the two typical mindsets that most people in the world have, this is based on research that has been done, is first of all, category one, believing, oh, we're victims. Think about how people respond to the pandemic. Oh, this was a random event. It came out of the blue. It hit us. We had no control over it. We're total victims. Whatever we do is futile. Oh gosh, woe is us. The second typical reaction is to believe that we are right and somebody else has done something wrong. You know, it's the fault of the Chinese that the virus happened, or it's the fault of these immigrants or these people who flew here and brought the virus, or it's the fault of the Blacks or the indigenous people who are not getting vaccines, or it's the fault of Asians, or it's the angry white middle-aged men or the women. It's always somebody else's fault, never our own. Now, the first category of people and their reaction of feeling like they're victims lead to emotional reactions of feeling helpless, hopeless, sad and despondent, fearful, anxious, and unable to take decisions. And when they do take decisions, half measures are taken. And we've seen this again in the response that our leaders have shown to COVID. Never fully sure what to do, dithering, vacillating, and every time they've acted, it's been too little too late. We're constantly playing catch up. The second group of people who believe they're right and everyone else is wrong have feelings of anger. They're always angry or frustrated or suspicious of others. And ultimately, the behavior then that each of these two categories of people demonstrate, for the first is the victims become paralyzed because they're so anxious, because they're so fearful, because they're so hopeless. On the other hand, the second group of people engage in conflict because they're angry and gosh darn it, they know that they're right and everyone else is wrong and someone else is to blame. Now, faith offers all of us an amazing gift. And frankly, it doesn't matter what faith you belong to. But as members of the Baha'i faith, we believe that the teachings of Baha'u'llah have provided us, as part of the manifold gifts that they bring, a set of lenses, a new set of lenses through which we can understand reality and interpret it. And that this set of lenses is extremely hope-inducing and constructive and allows us to then trigger the kinds of emotions of hope, of energy, of positivity, of enthusiasm, of trust, of courage that then propel us to behave in a way that is tireless and focused and methodical and with ceaseless energy to build the kind of world we want. Because we know that two people can experience the exact same reality, and yet their takeaway can be completely different. You know, the 20th century, the famous 20th century psychologist Viktor Frankl wrote about this in his book, Will to Meaning, in which he describes his experience in the Holocaust camp. And he says that there he saw that each of us in life, even though we're exposed to the same uncontrollable circumstances, like being in a concentration camp that you did not choose to be in, each of us can choose to react, and we have complete independence of mind and what he called a spiritual freedom, which is the freedom of choice in how we react. And he gives us an example. He says, I saw within the concentration camp people who behaved like angels, and I also saw people who behaved like swine. He said there'd be those who would get the same crust of dry bread in the morning, but they would look to see who else might need it more than they did. Those were the angels. And he said, by contrast, there were those who were just waiting for somebody to turn their back so they could snatch their piece of dried bread away from them. And those were the swine. So let's look at some of the, what I'd like to do tonight is to look at some of these new perspectives, these new lenses offered by the teachings of Baha'u'llah, through which we can understand why we're going through what we've been going through, why we've been going through the pandemic, what does it mean, what are the opportunities, and what are we meant to learn from it? And by doing so, we'll see that we have far more choices than we think we have in terms of what we do and how we react. Now, the first thing that the Baha'i writings throw in high relief, which I find fascinating, is that they immediately propose that the suffering we're experiencing is not the result of random events, but rather is part of our Creator's plan. Okay? So the question is, what if everything that has been happening is part of a very carefully crafted divine plan? There is nothing random or uncontrollable about it, even though we may feel like we're out of control. If this is true, how so and to what end? Why would the divine have put this as part of her or his or its plan? And what is the meaning of all of this? So the first thing that the Baha'i writings propose is that everything that we are going through and have been going through for the last close to 2 centuries and the suffering that it has entailed, including the world wars, is like preparing the ground in a garden or a field in order to plant new plants or crops. You know, before you can plant a garden, you have to first make sure that you remove the thistles and the weeds, because if you don't, when you plant the seed, as soon as that plant starts to make headway and grow, it's immediately strangled by those weeds. What are these weeds? These weeds are our old ways of thinking and our old ways of behaving that no longer serve us. Once we have brought these weeds to light by turning the ground upside down and pulling all this stuff out from the roots, again, raising to consciousness these old mindsets or ways of thinking that have been driving us, like the operating system of the computer, right? Once we do that, then we can root them out, and only then will we be ready to plant something new. So the Baha'i writings, speaking specifically to the people of this country, tell us that there are 3 specific kinds of weeds that we need to become conscious of and pull out from the very root. The first is rampant materialism. And of course, everything we've been going through with the crises we've been in, the pandemic and the economic crisis, have forced us into a situation where, for instance, we haven't been able to go out and mindlessly enjoy ourselves and waste as much time as we did. Even athletic games and concerts and major forms of entertainment were closed. We were all stuck at home. We had plenty of opportunity to reflect. We even had to work from home. We couldn't go spending the way we did. So it's like circumstances forced us to start thinking about, do I need all these things that I constantly reach for? Do these things actually conduce to my happiness, or do they make me so distracted in life that I forget what my true purpose in life is? Oh, and by the way, what is my true purpose in life, right? As we've had loved ones get sick and die, that again raises the question of what is the purpose of life and what can I do with the few short years that I'm alive on this planet? The second thing the Baha'i writings tell us that constitute these weeds is moral corruption. And again, during COVID, it's been amazing to see the amount of moral corruption that we have in our society, the layers being torn off and everything be brought to light. And the third thing is racial and other prejudices that are really banes and strangle any attempts we make to build a more just and peaceful society. Now, as in one place in the Baha'i writings, we're told that these difficulties that America in particular has gone through and will continue to go through will purge and purify it of its quote unquote anachronistic conceptions including, and I quote here, clinging tenaciously to the obsolescent doctrine. That means a doctrine whose day has come and gone. The doctrine of absolute sovereignty, America first, and upholding a political system manifestly at variance with the needs of a world already contracted into a neighborhood and crying out for unity. And then America is promised in the Baha'i writings that once she is purged of these old conceptions, she will be prepared to play a preponderating role in hoisting the standard of peace and the unification of mankind and the establishment of a world federal government on this planet. That is the destiny that the Baha'i writings view that this country has, which is an extremely glorious destiny. Like a loving parent, this divine plan of having these events happen that have as a byproduct suffering, like a loving parent, the Creator has designed these because this Creator is not going to allow us to squander our birthright, this destiny for which we have been born, and which, like the teenager that is heedless, we're likely to throw away because we don't have the foresight and the maturity yet to understand it. And the Baha'i writings, again, are very clear that one of the purposes of these suffering is to make sure that we are brought to account for our failures in the past, and also that we not shirk the responsibilities of the future. By the way, what are some of the responsibilities of the past that we're to be held accountable? Again, to me, this is very interesting, and I share this with you openly. The Baha'i writings are very clear that our Creator, who's the Creator of us all, regardless of whether we're religious or not, or whatever religious background we come from, or we're agnostic or atheist. You know, truth is truth, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. And this loving Creator, out of its love for us, entered into a covenant with us for eternity, that as long as creation existed, this Creator would send us divine guidance to show us the path to true happiness and fulfillment. And our part of the bargain was to recognize that guidance and follow it. You remember, this was the agreement made with Noah after the great flood. And the symbol was the rainbow, which I always find very exciting. To the extent that we fail with the coming of each of these divine teachers who have come in a progressive chain of continual and progressive revelation, to the extent that we fail to recognize these divine teachers and accept their teachings and follow them, we have broken that covenant that we entered to with our Lord. And now Baha'u'llah says that, who is Baha'u'llah being the latest, we believe, in this series of continual and progressive revelations, that our Creator is going to call us to account, again, just as a loving parent does. You can get away with so much, but there comes a point where the parent says, hey, in order to learn and for your own good and for your own growth, you have to suffer some consequences. Otherwise, we don't pay attention and we keep heedlessly and mindlessly continue our own way. So this is the first lens, that the suffering, it has a role of purging, purifying, and preparing the soil for new ways of thinking and behaving. On to the second lens. The second lens is that everything in this world, to give birth to anything new in this world, involves two simultaneous processes of integration and disintegration. This is a requirement of birthing process, whether you're talking about a seed that you plant in the ground, and that seed has to break open and go through a lot of chaos and tumult before a plant can emerge through the broken and putrefied seed, or whether you're talking about the animal kingdom or insect kingdom or the human kingdom. Similarly, the Baha'i writings and Baha'u'llah tell us that in order for us to build a new world order, or give birth to a new civilization, which is based on a foundation of peace and justice, we are going to see a process of the old way of being, of the old world disintegrating, while a new one is simultaneously being built. Baha'u'llah goes further and says that the energies that have caused these two processes to be initiated are spiritual energies that were released with his coming, and that this is so whenever a new divine teacher comes into the world. He goes on to tell us that the momentum of both of these forces of integration and disintegration are accelerating and will accelerate until they converge in the birth of something new. So let's look at an analogy that will help us really understand this. The analogy is that of a butterfly that becomes a butterfly having started life as a caterpillar. Let's take a quick look at it. So the caterpillar is this clumsy earthbound creature, spends its days doing what? Eating as much as it can eat, gorging itself. And every time it gets too big for its skin, it sheds the skin and continues eating and eating and eating. And it goes through this process several times until it stops and creates a cocoon around itself that you can see in this slide. Now, once it goes into this cocoon, a very interesting process starts to happen. It starts to excrete enzymes. So the caterpillar itself excretes certain chemicals. And what do these chemicals do? They start to eat up and cause the body of the caterpillar to disintegrate. Now, if you were to look inside the cocoon, you would see that this is a very messy, disgusting process. It's goopy, it's disgusting. You would think, nothing good is happening here. However, there is something happening that you can't see when you look at the cocoon. Within the old caterpillar, there were certain groups of cells called imaginal discs. And each group of cell contained not very many cells, but each group of cells had a counterpart in the new butterfly that is going to emerge. As this putrefaction and this disgusting process starts to take place in the cocoon, simultaneously, and now here's the process of integration, the cells start to multiply. Each of these groups of cells start to multiply and start to multiply very rapidly, creating the different parts of the butterfly that is to emerge. At some point, when the caterpillar is completely destroyed, at the same time as enough parts of the butterfly have been integrated and come into being and formed, when these two processes converge, the cocoon opens and out comes, and this is the part we see, the birth of something new. Now look at this butterfly. The butterfly is a completely different order of creation from the caterpillar. Unlike the caterpillar, which was earthbound, the butterfly can fly. It has far greater perspective. It can travel so much farther. It is light. It is beautiful. It's a totally different order of creation. This is exactly what's happening with the world today. Baha'u'llah says that the world is in a state of pregnancy and its agitation waxes every day. And he says, soon will come the time when it will have yielded its noblest fruit. That is the time when the butterfly emerges or the fruit comes out. But meanwhile, what we're seeing and experiencing and suffering from is the disintegration of the old. And most of us are not seeing that there are actually pockets of integration happening and they are accelerating. And indeed, I would suggest and submit that during the COVID crisis, as a result of all the suffering we've seen, we have started to look deeply for the first time at certain critical issues like, institutional racism. This is nothing new in this country. It's existed from the birth of this nation. And yet now is the time when we are starting, these cells are starting to multiply, increasing numbers of people are starting to become aware and have their consciousness raised and their consciences pricked, and are starting to reflect and think and consult and have conversations around these topics that in the past we wanted to shove beneath the carpet because we were more comfortable that way. So this analogy also illustrates 2 or 3 other things that the Baha'i writings say about suffering. The writings tell us that convulsive changes that we will see in the world will release the potentialities latent within us, just like these imaginal discs, right? The Baha'i writings also tell us that the sufferings will infuse in us the capacity, the virtues, the powers, the moral standards, and the tools to take the next step in achieving our rightful destiny. So, this is the second filter, understanding that we're just going through a very normal birthing process. And yes, it's messy because of the twin processes of integration and disintegration. The third lens given to us by the Baha'i writings, that to me is one of those lenses that instills so much understanding, wisdom, and hope, is the lens that humanity as a whole, as a collective unit, has been going through various stages of development, starting from infanthood and working towards maturity. And that we are now in the throes of a very turbulent adolescence. And we've all been adolescents, or many of us have had adolescence or have them now. And we know what that stage is like. It's a time of experimentation, of pushing the boundaries, of acting out. And sometimes the behavior can be very, very risky. But being parents, knowing that this is just a phase and that our young people will emerge eventually, some sooner, some later, but will emerge into maturity, we don't throw them out of the house, right? Instead, we exercise patience, loving kindness, we continue to guide and advise them, and we demonstrate compassion. These are exactly the qualities that we need to bring to bear in how we treat ourselves as communities, as societies, and as a human race. Yes, our behavior has been and is appalling. Yes, we've been engaged in racism and prejudice, and we're currently seeing a resurgence of nationalism and xenophobia and misogyny and all kinds of prejudice, on and on and on. And yet, if you believe that this is just a stage in the development of humanity, then we don't give up. The problem with believing that this is just who we are and that we're not going to change and that we've always been evil or greedy or selfish and will always remain so, is that, as any good coach will tell you or good psychologist, that you tell a person that and you have stunted their growth. They're dead in their tracks, because they immediately become depressed, they start beating themselves up, and also they feel, understandably, like whatever they do is futile. It's that victim mentality. No matter what I do, I can't change anything. There's no point, which is why it leads to paralysis. Remember, that was the first category of people. And this belief that we're intrinsically evil, or that our future equals our past and that we're doomed to repeat our past, these two are two of the most self-destructive beliefs that any human being can have. Self-destructive false assumptions and limiting beliefs. They are those two of those pernicious weeds that we need to pull up and get rid of so that we can then start planting the seeds of constructive and positive action that will take humanity to the next stage. All right, So in other words, what we're actually saying here is that suffering affords us a tremendous opportunity for growth. If we're saying that we're in this stage of adolescence that is then going to lead to a stage of maturity, the hallmark of which is a unified humanity based on the foundation, built on a foundation of peace and justice, what we're saying is that suffering can be an amazing opportunity for growth. So in what ways? Let's look practically at the ways in which we can grow. One of the ways is that suffering creates an awareness of certain fundamental truths and principles that govern the essence of human life on this planet. You might, some refer to it as spiritual awareness. Fundamentally, even if you don't believe in God, spiritual awareness involves recognizing that humanity is a single organism and that humanity is governed by an essential law, a social law, if you like, or a spiritual law, if you're that way inclined, which is the law of the oneness of humanity. Let's start with the truth that humanity has become a single organism. We live in a world that is interconnected and interdependent in an unprecedented way, thanks to communications and trade and globalization and all the interconnections. Nothing can happen in one part of the world that doesn't immediately affect another part of the world. And we've seen this demonstrated over and over again with the Fukushima disaster, where the nuclear reactor melted, with this virus that emerged in China and then went around the whole world. And, you know, we're all in this together. There is a famous Singaporean diplomat who has provided a beautiful analogy of how our world, where our world is today, and this principle that it's a single organism. He says that for many years, humanity consisted of 192 or 93 boats bobbing on the sea of international life. And he says that our main goal was to make sure that these boats didn't collide with each other. He said, but that is no longer true. We now are a ship with 193 cabins on it. And he said, while each of the cabins is very well, the internal affairs of each cabin are very well run, and there are crew stewards to deal with the internal affairs of the cabin, the ship as a whole lacks a captain and crew. And so if there's turbulence in our world, as with the COVID-19 pandemic or the global economic recession, and go on, if we have a nuclear war, that is quite likely. There is nobody at the helm of the ship. We do not have institutions of global governance that are capable of dealing with the challenges, global challenges of today, or meeting the needs of humans. So that's one. That is one truth that this suffering has enabled us to start to understand. And we're seeing it now, especially because of vaccine availability. The fact that only the wealthier nations have access to vaccines, and less than 3% of the population in Africa, I think it's even less than 2% has been vaccinated, in Asia less than 3%, in countries like India less than 5%, means that this virus is going to continue to mutate, and these mutations now are getting stronger, as we're seeing with the Delta variant, and with each new mutation that arises in some other part of the world, we are also exposed to risk, even if we're vaccinated, right? Because the chances of a breakthrough infection increase. So we're all in this ship together. We sink or swim together, and this is something we need to realize. The second opportunity for growth is understanding that just as there is a physical law, or there are physical laws that govern our world, such as the law of gravity, there are also social or spiritual laws that govern our existence. And the social law is the law of oneness, of the oneness of humanity. Now, yes, we can choose to ignore it or say, I don't believe that. And we're perfectly entitled to, because every human being has been given the gift of free will choice. I can insist that I don't accept the law of gravity, and I will bring the cup to the edge of the table, and lo and behold, guess what? Gravity is going to operate on my glass of water and it will fall, whether I like it or not. I would also be pretty foolish to try to build an airplane not taking into account the law of gravity. I can choose to ignore it, but I won't be successful building a plane, or if I am marginally successful, it is going to crash and cause a lot of injury and damage. Now, the same is true about this law of oneness. It is a law whether we like it or not. It is one of those truths of social reality that has always existed, and yet we have blithely ignored it. We are now facing the consequences of building social institutions, political, economic, environmental, religious, it doesn't matter, that have not taken into account this law of oneness. And it is no wonder that we're now seeing all of these social institutions spectacularly failing us. So this process of disintegration is partly a consequence, an effect of our heedlessness as to the law of oneness and our failure to take it into account when we build all kinds of institutions, social institutions that govern our social reality. So this is really a very, very key point. Now, what can we do with this new understanding of our interconnectedness, that we're a single organism, and the fact that there's this law of oneness? Well, one opportunity, because remember this presentation is about not just finding meaning in the suffering, the meaning being us becoming aware and conscious of these new truths and creating these new mindsets and perspectives that lead to new emotions and new behavior and therefore new reality. But what new habits, what new opportunities do we have? So I wanted to give you an example here. And one of the examples is one of the opportunities afforded by the suffering is that we can now replace the outworn habit of nationalism, which is on the rise again, and I am aware of that, with a new system of global governance. You know, our world is facing a number of global crises that are existential. In other words, they threaten our very survival as a human race. We know about climate change. That's definitely one of them. And we know that climate change is becoming increasingly catastrophic. If you've been following the news, and given where Texas is, you're aware that in the southwest of the country, water, for instance, in Lake Mead that provides water to 25 million people in 3 states is at its lowest level in this reservoir since the year it was built in 1936. Farmers are starting to sell their cows because they can't get their hands on 50 gallons of water a day per cow to feed those cows and keep them alive. Farmers are also starting to leave large tracts of their farms fallow. They can't grow anything because they can't afford the water. There is no water. This is going to have knock-on effects around the country. Less food, higher prices. We're already in economic difficulties, and up it goes. We also have less access to fresh water. It's becoming increasingly scarce, not just in the United States, but around the world. And these are just some small consequences of climate change. You have the wildfires and the storms and the cyclones and the rising waters and entire nation states disappearing underwater, and on and on and on. There are many. Then we have the threat of a nuclear war. You know, we think that it's behind us now, but actually it's not. The nuclear threat now is at its highest since the heyday of the Cold War, when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what's frightening is that only recently, very recently, what's been coming to light is that humanity was closer to a nuclear war than any of us ever knew it. It happened in the 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis. We have now learned, because of papers, classified papers that the Soviets had that were in the Ukraine that have just recently been declassified, we've only now started to understand what danger we put behind us during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The amount of the number of things we did not realize. President Kennedy did not realize that there were actually active nuclear warheads on Cuba. He didn't know that the commanders on the ground had been given delegated authority to initiate strikes without getting the permission of their superiors. We narrowly avoided a nuclear torpedo from a Soviet submarine, because the poor guy who was underwater when he came up had strikes, grenades were being thrown from American airplanes, and he thought that World War III had started. So he gave the order for a nuclear torpedo to fire. What then happened was that, fortunately, an American ship that was close by realized what was happening and gave a signal to the submarine saying, we're sorry, please don't fire. The submarine would not have seen that apology had it not been for the fact that the tower in which their watchman was, he was trying to close the tower so the submarine could dive so they could shoot this nuclear torpedo. It got stuck. And it was only because it got stuck that they realized that this was a mistake, and they were able to pull back from the brink in the last second. Similar story in 1958 in the Taiwan Straits. Similar story. Apparently, the American government, again, based on new documents that have very recently come to light in the United States that were classified, we were preparing for nuclear strikes inside China, starting with their airfields, if they didn't stop bombing islands belonging to Taiwan. Again, we came this close to a nuclear war. And what would be the problem of a nuclear war, even if it's short, geographically limited, even if it lasts a day? I don't know if you're aware, but experts tell us that even a limited nuclear war will lead to 10 years of no summer and no crops that will cause 1 billion people around the world to starve. So if we think the pandemic is bad, if we don't arrest nuclear proliferation and stop the threats of nuclear war by having a proper system of global governance, i.e. a world parliament and a world executive that are truly representative of the peoples of the world and who function through processes that are, in which the voices of everybody are heard, and so on. So there's a whole system here. If we don't do that, we're potentially doing ourselves. Okay, so this is one of the opportunities. Another opportunity that this understanding of the fact that we're a single organism and the law of oneness affords us is the opportunity to learn to elect worthy and fit leaders. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but interestingly, the Baha'i writings have a lot to say about what we should be looking for in our leaders. And I'm not talking about the Baha'i administrative system. I'm talking about Baha'i writings that address what we do in electing members of parliament or Congress or people in our secular system, so to speak. What kind of qualities should we be looking for? Should we be looking for qualities? What kind of motivations? How we hone the skill of the independent investigation of truth about who the people who are running for election are, and on and on and on. So this is another tremendous opportunity. And again, it excites me to see that as a result of this pandemic, we're starting to look carefully. Of course, there's not agreement, and it's a source of very vigorous debate and even conflict, but we're looking at our voting systems and our and our whole system for electing people. And the question then becomes, I'm not going to get into it now, what is the role of power in society? What is the role of those in authority? And do we have old perspectives around this that are like those weeds that we need to get rid of? I've covered this at length in the book that Ajit mentioned, my new book, The Alchemy of Peace, 6 Essential Shifts in Mindsets and Habits to Achieve World Peace. So if you're interested, you can pick up a copy and follow that, but it's a very interesting area. Okay, let's move on. The other opportunity we have and the other meaning that suffering has is it gives us the opportunity to weld the divided components of a fragmented humanity into one indivisible whole. There is an image given to us in the Baha'i writings about how suffering welds these pieces of iron together. Again, let's look at it very quickly. Each piece of iron is hard and rigid and cold and is very independent and very ossified, is not going to change, has no flexibility. Think of our society. Think of our political polarization, the extreme positions we take, the entrenched positions. And we think about nationalism as between nations, each wanting the good of their own people, my folks at the expense of others if necessary. Think about xenophobia, fear of strangers and immigrants, and racism and sexism. These are all forms of this rigidity and wanting to maintain my identity as this piece of iron. So what happens is when you put the fire of suffering under this metal, it becomes warm and it softens and the color becomes warmer. And soon you can then put it in an anvil and forge these pieces into one indivisible whole. And once they cool off together, things that have been separate pieces become one indivisible piece. The Baha'i writings tell us that the suffering we're experiencing and will continue to experience will follow a process that will lead to this kind of unification of humanity. Here's the process outlined in the writings. That adversity, difficulty will be prolonged, sorry guys, worldwide, allied to chaos and universal destruction. And what will happen as a result, this is the good part, first step, will stir the conscience of the world. We're starting to see this with racism, right? Anti-Black racism in this country. The conscience of the people of this country has started to be stirred just with COVID-19 and the protests. Second step, the masses of people will become disillusioned. You know, you've got to be at a point to recognize that the old ways of doing things don't work and be willing to let go of them before we do something new. And we're not going to get there unless we are disillusioned with the old way of doing things. Only then, so after conscience stirring and disillusionment of masses, will there come a radical change in the very conception of society. This is a quote. A radical change in the very conception of society. So what's exciting to me is, again, in the United States, we're starting to see early glimmerings of this within our nation. Our desire and willingness to start to reconceptualize the role of police in our society is part of a radical change in the very conception of society. The conception of the role of the different groups within a society play, right? And the fact that we're starting to hear, and it's exciting to me, I hear this on the news more often, we're moving past talking about tolerating people who are different from us to recognizing that we're missing out if we don't hear their voices and include them, because every group of people, every ethnicity, every race, every gender has some unique gifts and qualities to contribute to the whole. This is a new conversation for this society in the US. We're starting to happen it. And to me, again, It's a first glimmering of this radical reconceptualization. The final stage, according to the writings, is that we will, as a result of this radical change in the conceptualization of society, we will coalesce and bring together the disjointed, bleeding limbs of mankind into one body, single, organically united and indivisible. And the analogy that the teachings of Baha'u'llah give us are, interestingly, to the Civil War of the United States, in which the US moved as a result of that civil war, in which we lost 2% of our population in 1861, which is the equivalent of 6 million people today. We would have lost 6 million of today's people. And that moved us from being a union into a nation. It forged our identity as the United States of America. So, friends, we stand at a fork in the road. We have a choice to make. How much more do we want to suffer? We're not doomed to suffer. It's a choice because we've made certain choices about how we interpret events, what our perspectives are, which have then triggered certain emotions that have led to certain behaviors that have resulted in this reality that we're all living today that many of us really don't like. And the good news is that we're not doomed to repeat our past. Our past does not define who we will be in the future. Where we are now is just a snapshot of who we are. It's time to put aside our limiting beliefs, our false assumptions, and emerge from our cocoon with new ways of thinking and behaving that are necessary to build a world that is peaceful, based on justice, and ultimately unified. For those of you who might be interested in hearing more of these mindsets and habits and what practical steps we can take to move us from where we are to this amazing vision of a just and peaceful world, I invite you to check out this book, The Alchemy of Peace. It's available on Amazon, both in digital form and soft paperback form. This is what the cover looks like. And for Baha'is who want to get it, you can get it at BDS or Baha'IBookstore.com. So thank you very much for your patience. And I will now, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing my slides and then move to the chat. Let's see.
All right. Nabil?
Yes, so we have first question over Zoom from Arastu and Ryane. It says, do you think that humanity could have avoided the sufferings if it had heeded and implemented Baha'u'llah's teachings?
That's a good question. And as a matter of faith and as a matter of what the Baha'i writings themselves say, not what I think, because really what I think is irrelevant, the answer is yes. In fact, Baha'u'llah famously said wrote to the leaders of the world, saying that now that you leaders, because Baha'u'llah wrote, this is again a historic event, he wrote to all the rulers, the secular and religious rulers of his time, calling them to heed, to basically respond to that voice of God, and be loyal to the covenant with the Almighty, which is to recognize the coming of each divine teacher and to follow his teachings. And then he wrote to them and said, since you have failed to do that, had you heeded my call and obeyed my teachings, you would already in his lifetime have seen what he called the most great peace, which is a peace based on the spiritual awareness of the oneness of humanity. He said, now that you have failed to do that, you have to be contented with the eventual evolution of what's called, the Baha'is refer to as the lesser peace. This is a phrase from Baha'u'llah's writings, which is a secular peace based on an end to war initially, but in which a lot of our deep social problems won't be solved, like problems of religious conflict and racism. Again, this is all based on the Baha'i writings. And then the second stage would be after we achieve the lesser peace, achieving the most great peace. So yes, we could have avoided a lot of these sufferings. And he himself has said that. He said you could have mitigated a lot of these sufferings.
Thank you. There's a comment and a question on YouTube. The comment says, love the piece about what happens, and this was what happens when we ignore an essential law, such as the law of oneness, when building our institutions. The question comes and says, I've seen some talk today asking if there is a God, why does he allow suffering? In light of some of the atrocities we see in the world, would you say that all suffering is necessary?
Okay, good, really good question. Thank you for that. So, as ever, this is a complex question. So why does God, if there is a God, if there is a creator, how could such a creator allow suffering, right? So the Baha'i writings have something interesting to say. And let me start by saying that for those of you who may not know, there's no clergy in the Baha'i faith, okay? So as I sit here and share reflections with you, please understand that these are based on my personal understanding of the teachings of Baha'u'llah and the writings of the faith as I have read and understood them. And they're not, you know, and I don't get to impose my views on others, but if you ask, I definitely will, am happy to and will share. And I urge you to, as a second step, to go and do your own independent investigation of truth, which is a fundamental tenet of the Baha'i faith, that we shouldn't blindly follow what other people tell us, but we should go and investigate for ourselves. So having started there, my understanding of the writings of Baha'u'llah on this are as follows. There is an old tradition, actually from Islam, that starts with the words, I love to be known, hence I created creation. And the son and successor, who was an authorized interpreter of Baha'u'llah's writings, Abdul Baha, wrote a commentary on this. And essentially, the short story is that the creator really, really, really wanted to be loved, and therefore chose to create human beings, humanity, and give us this amazing gift of free will, so that based on that free will, hopefully we would choose to love this creator, him, her, it. It's impossible to, you know, encapsulate the creator, and so we just use words, limited words. Now, it's like if you're in love with someone, if you could force them to love you, there'd be no pleasure in that, right? Because you would always wonder, if they had a choice, would they choose to love me? And apparently the creator felt the same way, wanted to be loved because we chose to love the creator. Now, this gift of free will choice then extends into all areas of life, and extends into even, you know, acceptance. As I say, we have the choice to accept the law of gravity or not. We have the choice to say, yes, there's a creator, no, there isn't a creator. Or yes, there's a creator, but I don't recognize this divine teacher, or I do. As Jesus Christ, as John said in the Gospel of St. John, he talks about the coming of Jesus Christ. And he said that Christ came not in order to sit in judgment on people, but he says the very act of Christ's coming led to judgment, because people had to choose to accept him or deny him. And by that very exercise of free will and that exercise of choice to accept or deny, we ourselves separated the wheat from the chaff. So there was an act of judgment in the very choice. Now, you take all of this in tandem, as I do, and we come to the question of the questioner, is how could God stand by? Well, our creator has given us the choice to behave in certain ways and not. If certain human beings have chosen to create laws or create countries based on, say, institutional racism, this is not the will of God. This is a consequence of what happens when human beings have free will. And when large numbers of human beings, or those in power, a minority sometimes, exercise their choices in ways that are oppressive and lead to injustice. And should we just sit back and accept that injustice? Absolutely not. Again, the Baha'i writings are very clear on that, that it is our responsibility, having created these injustices, to undo them and bring about justice. Now, Baha'u'llah says that he has come to bring about the most great justice, and that without justice, peace and unity are impossible, right? Which is becoming increasingly clear to us. And it is by giving us these new mindsets and these new understandings about who we are. So for instance, one of the teachings of Baha'u'llah that says that the soul, which is the animating power that makes us human, has no gender. And that when we shed the physical body, when we die, our soul continues to live through eternity. Boy, are we all going to be in for a shock if once we basically make the transition and recognize that all these false constructs that we've been living by in this world and all the injustices were just meaningless. Now, it doesn't mean that those who suffer here are not suffering real suffering and unjustly. Yes, there's injustice in the world, but God isn't going to step in at every step and protect us from ourselves, because it would make the whole notion of free will nonsensical. Having said that, Baha'u'llah says that God gives us a chance, again, like a loving parent. You give your children rope because they have to learn how to be independent. You can't step in at every point and say, no, don't step here, don't step there, nope, don't do this, don't do that, don't talk to this friend. You've got to let go up to a point so that the child will grow and become an independent adult. However, Baha'u'llah says the time will come when God's patience will have run out. And then he's going to step in. And I guess my own view is that what we're starting to experience in the world is the beginning of that, creator getting fed up with us, and it's time for all of us to learn our lessons. And for me, again, personally, I think the pandemic and the economic recession is just the beginning of it. I'm not surprised that the pandemic is not at an end, because I look to see, have we learned our lessons? If we haven't, the job isn't done yet. And even if we somehow get this pandemic under control, if we don't learn our lessons, I, for one, feel absolutely confident that there will be more increasingly greater challenges. Climate change already is the big truck hurtling down the hill at us, and it is going to be devastating in and of itself. And I wouldn't be surprised if, as I say, the nuclear gets in the mix of it. And they're already telling us to expect more pandemics that could be more virulent than this one. So unfortunately, we're all in the soup together. And I think we're all going to experience suffering in ways that wake us up. That's the goal here, to wake us up. I think I answered, and is suffering inevitable, I think was the second part of the question.
Is it necessary?
I think, is it necessary? Again, the writings have a lot to say on this, given the way human beings tend to function. It seems to be necessary for us to learn lessons. Technically, it's not necessary. In other words, we could choose to learn our lessons and grow and mature. We could be that teenager who doesn't have to experiment with drugs and alcohol and getting venereal diseases by sleeping around, or driving fast and ending up in car crashes. We could be that teenager, but by and large, we choose not to be that teenager. We choose to act out. And so, yeah, it looks like we have to learn through suffering. And as I say, a whole lot of this suffering is cause and effect, the result of our own decisions that we have made, right? So I hope that helped.
Thank you. So here's something I've been wondering. I didn't grow up in the United States, but I've lived here all my adult life. But so I noticed a difference in the orientation, I guess, of people in other countries, smaller countries mostly. And so my question is, how do we convince a big, powerful nation that seems mostly self-absorbed and largely uninterested in what happens to the rest of the world to accept this principle of oneness? There is nothing that drives it to do that.
Yeah. Well, we have to get it's a very good point you make. I'm not worried that seems to be the worry of many people. I don't worry about that because I have absolute confidence that if you like, the finger of God working through global events and through events that you and I don't drive, that I'm not interested in driving, right? I'm not interested in creating chaos so that humanity will suffer and learn its lessons. That's what just to be very clear about what I'm talking about. There will be enough opportunity for people to come to that. However, somebody needs to be pointing the way and holding up what the new perspective and understanding is. Let me give you an example. The founder of what is today known as the European Union was a gentleman called Jean Monnet, who was a simple Frenchman who loved his country and really wanted peace in Europe. And his country, France, had fought wars with the neighboring country, Germany, for centuries, fighting over access to coal and steel. And Jean Monnet really, really, really wanted peace. He wanted an end to these wars, and they would particularly fight over these pieces of territory on the border that were rich in coal and steel. And many, many would die, and there was hatred. And the way they talked about each other is very similar to the way Arabs and Israelis sometimes talk about each other. We drink each other's hatred with our mother's milk, and we'll always hate each other, and we'll always be at war with each other. Really odd to think they were writing this just a few decades before they became what's known as the European Union. So this man, Jean Monnet, was walking around for a while talking about the fact that, hey guys, we can be united and we can have peace. And he had a mechanism by which to do it, which was to take all the coal and steel and pool it in the hands of a supranational organization that didn't belong to any country, that sat above countries and that would have jurisdiction to distribute coal and steel on an equal basis. So think about like taking vaccines and pooling them in the hands of a supranational world organization that can allocate them fairly to all the nations of the world, and also to encourage production of the vaccines and ensure distribution at reasonable prices, okay? People, he would show up and people would say, oh my God, there he goes again. Seriously, look around you. This is reality. These countries hate each other. What are you talking about? In his autobiography, he says that I knew that things would change. And I knew a time would come when all these naysayers, the situation would get so bad and they would be basically so helpless, not knowing what next step to take, that those very same naysayers would come to the person with a plan and say, just give it to us, we'll follow it. And that's exactly what happened. Europe got into a Second World War, was decimated, you know the story. And after the war, all the nations needed access to coal and steel to rebuild. Without it, they couldn't rebuild their buildings, their railroads, their ships, their industries, anything, right? And they adopted Jean Monnet's plan. So I say to you, have confidence and faith. We have an amazing plan. An analogy somebody gave is like the dam that we've all been drawing water from at the top of the mountain is giving way. There are cracks in it. It is going to fail. We can't be worrying about when and whether they're going to patch it up enough. We're downstream building a new dam so that when those waters flow and destroy things in their wake, we can invite people to something new and say, hey, look, we've got a new way of doing things. And believe me, having this it can be comforting to a lot of people even today. And you're already starting to see this consciousness growing, and you're starting to see people searching for something new. So it's already happening. I don't think we need to be disappointed or despondent. There's actually, I want to read to you a passage from a message of the governing body of the Baha'i faith in April 2020, last year, about this very point. They say, leaders, prominent thinkers, and commentators have begun to explore fundamental concepts and bold aspirations that in recent times have been largely absent from public discourse. At present, these are but early glimmerings, yet they hold out the possibility that a moment of collective consciousness may be in view. This is a thrilling note. And by the way, at the global level, also people are starting to look at things, and there's a whole big movement for the creation of a global world parliament, which didn't have traction. It's been, the idea has been out there for a while, but it's only in the last year and a half or so really gaining traction. People are starting to realize that we need completely new ways of thinking and new systems and new behaviors. It's coming.
Thank you. Friends, are there any more questions that you'd like to ask?
As somebody from India, I have a real concern about vaccine availability to the Indian masses. I have family members in India that contracted COVID and barely survived. So is there anything you want to say about that particular issue, vaccine distribution in the poorest countries? And India, I think they're charging people to give them vaccines, and they're not getting it for free. So if you don't have any money, you're basically out of luck.
Yeah, I read they changed that particular policy because it came under so much criticism. But look, this all points to, again, in some sense, it is by going through the experiences that countries like India, many countries in Asia, many Latin American countries, African countries, especially sub-Saharan countries, are going through, on and on and on, that we come to realize the need for a global system of government, basically a world government that has, as part of it, a world parliament, which, according to the Baha'i writings, will be the trustee of the earth's most important resources and will have as one of its responsibilities the duty to regulate the production and distribution of these, what I would term common goods. That phrase is not used in the Baha'i writings, but these are things that everybody needs to have access to. As I said, we need to get to the point where we're disillusioned, right? We need to see that our system is not working. And the irony, particularly with India, is that India produces 60% of the vaccines for the whole world. That is the ultimate irony, unfairness of it. That a country that produces 60% has not had enough to vaccinate its own peoples. So, and we've tried to take a step in that direction by setting up COVAX, which is this global agency. But again, it wasn't set up under a global institution that is represented by all the peoples of the world. Again, it's a joint project between private sector and public sector, and they come up with some formula for distributing equitably, and they only committed to vaccinating up to 20% of the peoples of countries that don't have the money, low-income countries, basically. And they haven't been able to get anywhere near that goal. So the system, because there's no mandatory system, we need a world parliament that can pass binding legislation that is binding on all countries. So everybody has to do certain things. We all have to do the same thing. So there's no favoritism, and on and on and on. So to me, this is just exhibit A, if you like, of the fact that people who argue that we don't need a system of global governance is like, oh yes, we do. And vaccine nationalism is exhibit A in that. So.
What you present is a new way of looking at things for the world. What kind of tools are available for us to share with the world? What do we, besides handing out books, what kind of tools are available to us to share this new understanding?
Most important tool, conversation. Talk to your friends. However you talk. It's at the water cooler, if it is at having coffee with a friend, if you're still in Zoom mode, then Zooming, if it's having tea with them, inviting them to dinner, inviting them to go for walks outside in the fresh air where you can be safe from COVID and social distance, whether it's writing a blog or doing a podcast, or, writing books is not for everybody. But if somebody who's written a book, you like the book, share it with others. There are 1,000,001 ways. Raising consciousness literally means sharing, however you share with others. And don't underestimate the power of ideas, because all you need, as we know, is a critical mass of people, which is usually a small percentage of people, to start thinking a certain way, and it flips. It's a tipping point where then the rest of society follows along. So just keep talking. This year I decided to experiment. I'd written books and blogs, and I like talking, but then there was no venue for talking other than Zoom talks. So I decided, but I missed being live with people. So I decided to experiment with video podcasting. And man, it's been so satisfying for me. I had weekly video podcasts, and now it's twice a month. And I've reached hundreds of people, and including lots of people I've never met before, but who are interested in the ideas. I mean, who knew that when you throw something out into the world, given this amazing internet that we have, people find you somehow, people who are interested in the topics you're discussing. So I've made a lot of new friends who are in other parts of the world, and we've had amazing conversations. They then contact me and want to have one-on-one conversations. So we've had 1.5 2-hour-long conversations and follow-up emails. And I've gotten to know about them and their families and, their hopes and their fears. And then the last thing I'll throw out there, and this is something I use, that especially in our very politically polarized country, I like to walk up to people, whether it's virtually or in person, and just talk to them and say to them, hey, look, I put it right out there. I am not partisan political, and I couldn't care less how you identify. And in fact, don't even tell me, because you are not a label to me. I am, however, interested in learning about you. And I have 2 or 3 questions that are my go-to questions. What are your fears? Because you really need to understand where people are coming from. What are your fears? What are your hopes? What keeps you up at night? And boy, you ask people those questions and then listen to them in a non-judgmental way, and that's key. You can't be broadcasting messages across your face as they tell you how they think that this group or other is the source of all evil, right? You have to say, oh my God, I can't believe you think that. You just got to love them and listen to them. And at some point, when they realize that you're not out to judge or criticize them, they will ask you, and what do you believe or think? And then there's the opportunity for planting the seeds, which they then have a choice to take or not. And that's all our job, is to share ideas, the message, thoughts. And people are adults. But when they see that we respect and honor them, and we don't judge them, and we don't categorize them, and we don't view them as a label, labels are really dangerous, because we think as soon as we label somebody, we think we understand them. It's the biggest danger. Oh, you're fill in the blank. Oh yeah, I know what you people are like. Yeah, Republicans, Democrats, whichever. Goes both ways. Oh, or you are fill in the blank, a race or gender or whatever. Oh yeah, I know all about you people. Really? Every human being is unique and wants to be viewed and seeks to be understood as a human being. So that is what I would say. Long answer to a short question, but it's such an important question.
If I could add, sorry, go ahead.
I just have a comment. I think as a Baha'i, let us try hard to raise in our children that we are created here to help each other. That's really a big principle. And I wish our schools teach, or with growing those, because really it's going to start from the young people to make us all united and forget about limits and countries. If we all can have in the school raised on the principle that we are here, or God created us here to help each other, not to hurt and not to be superior. I think if we can just have this principle, it can go a long way.
It's so true, as they say, from your lips to God's ears. And then we got to take the second step and say, okay, we're not in control of the schools, so we can wish, but we do have our junior youth programs and our children's classes. So we can actually offer exactly what you're talking about as Baha'i communities to people all over the world. Moral education of children, followed by, through the Junior Youth Empowerment Program, instilling that spirit of service in them. That's exactly what it's about, and you're so right. So the virtues and the spirit of service, because we can't control the school system. And I don't think we have the luxury. I mean, clearly we can't, because this is why the Universal House of Justice chose to go this route. They thought that we had the luxury of waiting until school systems took this on board. It might be too late. So yes, absolutely. So let's go forward and multiply these children's classes and junior youth groups, offer to serve as animators and teachers and so on.
Friends, for those of you that are on Zoom, I have posted Sovaida's YouTube channel site on there. So how often are you live, and are your old programs recorded so somebody can go in and watch them?
Yes, old recordings are there on the YouTube channel. If you're having trouble copying and pasting this, if you just go to my website, cpgg.org, and scroll to the bottom, you'll see a YouTube link there. So old recordings are there, and I'm now on the 2nd and 4th Saturdays of each month at 4 p.m. Eastern time. So 2nd and 4th Saturdays of each month at 4 p.m. So thanks for asking, 4 p.m. Eastern time.
This has been a delightful presentation, really, truly enlightening and delightful presentation. I suspect everybody here has learned a lot from you. And on behalf of our group here, I do truly want to thank you. It was actually good seeing you live after almost 20 years.
Yes.
Last time I saw you was in Wilmette. So it was good seeing you again after such a long time. Thank you so very much for doing this for us. And I hope that you'll come back again and do one more for us in the next 6 months, 8 months or so. Thank you, Sovaida.
It's really a delight to be here. Thank you
Thank you.
all for your patience. So thank you.